If learning a TCG is like an iceberg, most of what's near the surface is related to the rules, with the core rules of the game sitting above the surface and the implied rules, like resource curves and card advantage, sitting just under the water. A lot of games function perfectly well on this level. For example, chess has its core rules, as well as a carefully broken down sequence of opening plays and standard moves that are so important to mastering the game that they create an additional layer of implied rules. Each layer on this iceberg is going to take different amounts of time to master for different games. It will definitely take you much longer to master chess than it will be for you to master the average trading card game, but trading card games do deal with a few layers that standalone games like chess do not have. One of the most important is that trading card games have thousands of available game pieces, and more specifically, those game pieces have a very specific library of possible effects. In the implied rules of Magic, where you play one land per turn and draw one card per turn, the ideal cost curve is to play out a 1-cost card on turn 1, a 2-cost card on turn 2, and so on, curving out perfectly to maximize your mana value, until you no longer have any surplus cards in hand to devote to land drops, and you instead want to focus on playing one high-cost, high-impact spell per turn at the highest possible cost. We can see a perfect example of this ideal curve in Magic's online Momir format, where each card in your hand is either a land or can be treated as a random spell at a mana value of your choosing. In constructed formats, however, one extremely important thing that disrupts this ideal curve is the existence of the card Wrath of God, and similar mass destruction effects. If you play out a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, then a 3-drop, and then a 4-drop, and then your opponent plays nothing, Wrath of God, suddenly your opponent's gained a huge card advantage, and you likely didn't have enough time with your creatures for them to give you a meaningful damage advantage. In addition to mass destruction, removal and counter magic like Terror and Counterspell mean that you can trade a card with a mana cost of 2 for a card held by the opponent of practically any mana cost. This leads to the classic Dice Doomblade school of card evaluation. As a quick recap of what that is, when it was first printed, Doomblade was the most efficient piece of targeted removal that Black had ever received, and it immediately impacted how decks were built. The theory was that any creature that was more expensive than Doomblade needed to either have some kind of lingering advantage, such as positive enter the battlefield triggers or dies triggers, or have some kind of built-in protection effect that would allow it to stick around. Otherwise, it would die to Doomblade before you could attack with it and get value, and your opponent would immediately gain a substantial mana advantage. What this meant is that you were incentivized to play either low-cost aggro cards like Step Links, or resilient threats like Thragtusk, which would leave behind a 3/3 body and an additional 5 life, even if it was immediately removed as soon as it came into play. The existence of Doomblade, or other similar powerful removal effects in Magic, leaves even obviously powerful cards like Baneslayer or Shivan Dragon as less powerful than they will initially appear. For another example, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, powerful removal effects make cards like Blue Eyes White Dragon much weaker than its stat line and hefty tribute cost would suggest. The existence of efficient targeted removal and powerful board wipes substantially changes not only how cards are evaluated, but in Magic specifically, they're also the pillars that created the game's control archetype and playstyle. There are plenty of examples of the effect library of a game significantly changing how the game plays. Card advantage looks very different in games where Professor Oak exists, compared to games where you're happy casting Muldrifter. Taken a step further, games with very similar core rules are going to play very differently, depending on the effects available in those games. Wicross and Luck and Logic both have players protecting their life points by placing creatures in lanes to block the opponent's attack. But while removal is commonplace in Wicross, it's practically non-existent in Luck and Logic. So Luck and Logic has a much stronger emphasis on power buffs and winning creature combat, and is usually a significantly more grindy and card advantage focused game, while Wicross tends to be much faster and more focused on efficiently using removal and limited defenses in a much more tempo-oriented game. Where removal is present and has generally similar options, even then games are going to be very different depending on if that removal costs more or less than the creature it's removing. Even within a single game, card advantage can be very different depending on which effects are available. A card like Raigeki might be perfectly fine in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, where rapid special summons in a single turn is commonplace, but it can completely invalidate a mechanic like tribute summoning that requires several turns to build up to a high-powered monster, and might be completely busted in that context. In the early days of a game, these effects might be restricted to a single card, but as the game continues, these effects quickly cement themselves into the overall balance and structure of the game going forward, and even with format rotation, these staple effects generally don't change all that much. Unlike the rules, which are generally deliberate, creating an effect library can be an easy step for designers to overlook. When you're creating the first set of a game, often you're just looking for cards that seem like they play well together and promote interesting strategies. But once released, those cards will become pillars not just of a specific strategy on its own, but they'll also become pillars of the overall play of the game itself. They also establish standards going forward. A card like Lightning Bolt sets the standard for burn spells, and trying to claw that power back is going to run into a lot of player pushback. After Lightning Bolt, no one's going to be excited to play Shock. Likewise, a card like Lightning Bolt is going to exert pressure on all of your card designs going forward. If Bolt is your staple burn spell, then any card you expect to stick around had better have 4 or more toughness. If control decks are balanced around having easy access to a 4-mana sweeper and a 2-mana counter, then the whole archetype is going to struggle when the Wraths cost 5 and the counterspells cost 3. These effect categories end up building the game around themselves, and while they can be changed, maintaining game balance while you're doing so is very difficult. So, if you notice one class of effect ends up stronger than you expected, like the infamous Big 3 design mistakes, you either need to dial things back fast, often with an emergency ban, or just accept that you broke your game and that's the power level you're going to have to build around going forward. Sometimes the game system will push design towards a standard. In Luck and Logic, life is very tightly bound to creatures in play, so it makes sense that there's very little creature destruction. However, there's also a lot of leeway for customization, like Wicross with its plentiful removal, and I find that a lot of games tend to autopilot towards whatever the closest equivalent game has done before. An easy example of this is the Divination effect. Draw 2 cards for 3 cost. Likewise, having a once per turn draw 3 card in Hololive firmly lines it up with the Pokemon trading card game's expectations around card economy. So while Divination might be standard in Magic and a draw 3 might be standard in Hololive, what if a game running a Magic system had a draw 3 effect like Ancestral Recall? Well, that's a rather fun what-if alternate history type of thing for a Magic type game. Each new game that's created is an opportunity to explore all of these what-ifs. Do you want to avoid giving players mass destruction effects and see what the game does from there? Or do you think that mass hand destruction should be just as available as board destruction and build your game around that instead? For one rather extreme example, Flesh and Blood asks the what if of what if there were no permanents in the game at all? Overall, there is a lot of room to explore when you're crafting a trading card game, and what you choose to exclude is often going to have just as much of an impact as what you choose to include. So keep a close eye on what tools a game is giving its players to work with, and have a fantastic day.